Here we are at belief 16. By now you're probably very aware of changes in your life. But the basic problem, a lack of self-confidence and the need to be accepted by others, probably may not yet be totally gone. At this point in the program, some people will see small changes, others will see bigger changes. But I still promise you, the problem will be totally gone by the time you're done with this program. As I've reminded you before every other belief, you have to do every step of the Lefko belief process in order to eliminate each specific belief. Now, this belief is very different from almost all the others. It's like belief number 5, which was, what makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me. This type of belief is a survival strategy belief. Let me explain why we call it that. Remember how you had concluded about yourself as a very young child, I'm not good enough, and I'm not important? Holding those beliefs wouldn't make you feel very good, would it? Then one day you did something perfectly, like getting all A's on a report card, or doing a chore exactly the way your parents wanted it done. As a result, your parents gave you more time and positive attention than you usually got. How did you feel when you got such a positive response from your parents, teachers, or coaches? If you're anything like me, you felt pretty good about yourself, and quite important when you got that positive response as a child. It didn't take long for you to notice what was happening. You didn't feel good about yourself because you had already formed the beliefs, I'm not good enough and I'm not important. Then you did something perfectly that resulted in your parents' positive response to you. In your young mind, that meant they liked you, and being liked made you feel good about yourself and important. What would all this mean to a young child? Oh, I get it. What makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly. So the source of this belief is feeling negative about yourself, then doing things perfectly from time to time, and then getting a lot of praise that makes you feel good about yourself. It seemed to you that doing things perfectly made you good enough and important. Now, by the way, you might remember that this is similar to the source of the 5th belief. What makes me good enough or important is having people think well of me. That same situation could result in 2 different beliefs. Doing things perfectly and being thought well of make me good enough or important. This next belief, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly, isn't as common as many of the ones you've eliminated so far. But it is one that a large number of people hold. And it's one of the beliefs that generally underlies a lack of self-confidence. It also is one of the beliefs that frequently leads to workaholism. Here are a few ways to know if you have this belief. Do you often feel the need to do things perfectly? Do you sometimes avoid doing something because you're afraid you won't be able to do it just right? Are you only satisfied when you've done something perfectly or just about perfectly? Do you do things over and over until they're perfect? If you answered yes to any of these questions, you may believe what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly. In any case, it's important to at least be open to the idea you might have a belief like this, because if you have it, it's most likely holding you back in some areas of your life. And when you get rid of it, I promise you will see drastic changes in your life. Remember, you can hold a belief that intellectually you don't think is true about you. Today, as an adult, you might know that you don't have to do things perfectly to be good enough and important, but just knowing that isn't enough to eliminate the belief. Ultimately, the way to know if you have this belief is the same way to know if you have any belief. Say the words out loud and pause for a moment. If the words feel true or produce a negative feeling, even a small one, you probably have the belief. Try it right now. Please say out loud, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly, and then be still for a moment. Does it feel true or produce any feeling at all? If it does, you have the belief. You now know what it feels like to say these words when you have the belief. You'll say the same words out loud at the end of the process and will experience what the same words feel like when you no longer believe the statement. Okay then, Let's get rid of what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly. If you're absolutely certain that you don't have this belief, please click Next Belief and proceed to the next belief. If you have the belief, just let the program continue to play. Don't forget, though, that if you do have the belief, you could be missing out on the opportunity to get rid of it forever. And if you believe it even a little bit and you don't get rid of it, it will undercut your self-confidence. My voice will now stop so you can write down this belief in the text box on your computer monitor. Click Continue. When you're ready to continue with the process to eliminate the belief, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly. The next step to eliminate a belief is to figure out when you formed it. Most of our beliefs, certainly almost all of our self-esteem beliefs, including this belief, were formed from events involving your parents that occurred when you were a very young child. As I explained earlier, for most people, the source of the belief, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly, was being praised only when they did things just right or perfectly. They would be praised if they got an A, but not a B. They would be praised if they cleaned their room spotlessly, but not if even one thing was out of place. They would be praised for performing flawlessly in sports, but not for just improving. And after receiving this praise, they felt good enough or important. Now, take a look at your early life and see where the belief, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly, comes from for you. Take note of when you were praised for doing something just right and how it made you feel good enough or important. Then type into the text box on the screen the type of things your parents did and said in your childhood that led you to form this belief, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly. Describe what actually happened, such as, my father said things like, you did that just right, only when I did something perfectly, and he treated me better when I did things perfectly. Afterwards, I really felt good about myself. Take the time you need because this is important. When you're done writing, click Continue. Now the program will pause. Look at the events you've written down. Is it real to you that the conclusion you reached, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly, is a valid interpretation of those events? Can you agree that virtually any child at that age and in those situations would have reached a similar conclusion? Okay, now we're going to play the possibilities game. Well, imagine that 4 friends of yours are visiting you and looking at a videotape of the events you just wrote down. Your interpretation of those events when you were a child was, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly. That is one valid interpretation of Mom and Dad's behavior. That interpretation wasn't wrong, but there are other reasonable interpretations of the same childhood events that you didn't think of as a child. So let's ask each of your friends for another alternative interpretation. Can you see that one friend might well say, doing things perfectly is certainly one way to become good enough and important, but it's definitely not the only way. Couldn't the events in your childhood be explained by this interpretation, just as well as your interpretation, that what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? Here's what your second friend says. Doing things perfectly was the way to be good enough and important in your parents' eyes, but not necessarily in the eyes of all people. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood, just as well as your interpretation, that what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? Here's a third possible interpretation of your childhood events that one of your friends suggests. When you did things perfectly, you felt good enough or important. But did that feeling last? If not, it only made you feel good enough or important for a little while, but didn't really make you good enough and important. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation? That what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? Here's another interpretation from your fourth friend. As a kid, you thought you were not good enough and not important, but it was never really true. Is it real to you now that those beliefs never were true? Is it real they were just meanings you assigned to meaningless events? So if you were good enough and important to begin with, what did you have to do to become good enough or important? Nothing. Couldn't any one of these interpretations explain your childhood interactions with your parents just as well as your original interpretation, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? Of course they can. So is it real to you that a belief you've lived with almost your entire life, something you thought was a fact is not a fact, isn't the truth at all? It's only a truth, merely one interpretation of many possible interpretations of earlier events, right? With a little help from me and your friends, you can see that not feeling good enough or important, then doing things perfectly and getting praise from your parents, teachers, or coaches, and finally feeling really good about yourself could have at least 4 different reasonable interpretations or meanings. Do you remember what you wrote down a few minutes ago as the source of your belief, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? Look at the text box below on your screen. Right now, imagine seeing what you saw then and hearing what you heard then. Take a few minutes and really imagine the events of your childhood that led you to forming the belief what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly. Didn't it seem when you were a child as if you could actually see what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly in those early events with your parents? It did, didn't it? You may have the sense that you didn't see the belief, you felt it. Once you formed the belief, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly, you probably did feel it. I'll get back to the feeling in a minute. But what I'd like you to focus on now is not the feeling, but on my question. When you were being praised for doing things just right, didn't it seem as if you saw what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? As if you could point to it? As if you could have said to me, can't you see what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? Now that you think you saw what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly as a child, I'd like you to look again. Did you really see what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? If you did, what does what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly look like? Could you really point to it? Does what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly have a color, a shape, a location? Is it real to you now that you saw events but never really did see what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? If anything you can really see can be described, and if you can't describe what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly looks like, is it clear now that you never really saw it? Since you never really saw what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly, what did you actually see? Is it clear now all you really saw was your parents praising you for doing things to their standards? In other words, all you really saw was a series of events? You see, what happened was that you looked at a series of events that can be interpreted in many different ways. You gave the events one meaning, which was what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly. By giving that specific meaning to the events, each time you were praised for doing things a certain way, it was as if you could see that meaning in those events. But you didn't discover the meaning in the events. You gave the meaning to the events. They had no meaning before you created one. Is it real now that the events had no meaning until you gave one to them? Here's another way to understand that events have no inherent meaning. When I say that, I'm saying you don't know anything for sure about the kind of person you are as a result of these childhood experiences. What do I know for sure about your worth as a human being, or what makes you a good human being, just from knowing what your parents praised you for as a child? Is it clear that I wouldn't know anything? And if I don't know anything, you don't either. All you know for sure is what actually happened. You got praise when you did things your parents wanted, and then you felt good about it. And finally, if you never saw what makes me good enough or important as doing things perfectly out there in the world, where has it been all these years? Did I hear you say that what makes me good enough or important as doing things perfectly has only ever existed in your mind? That you never did see it out there in the world? That's right. If the belief is more real to you as a feeling than as a concept, here's another way to look at it. Didn't it seem as if your parents' behavior and comments when you were a child made you feel what makes me good enough or important as doing things perfectly? But you just agreed that the events have no meaning. Is it possible for events that have no meaning to make you feel what makes me good enough or important as doing things perfectly, or anything else for that matter? Of course not. So if being praised for doing things perfectly couldn't have made you feel what makes me good enough or important as doing things perfectly, what did make you feel that? By now I think you know the answer to that question. Please answer out loud. That's right. You felt that only because that's the meaning you had already given to being praised. Let me help you make this real. Imagine that I had been there when you were a little child and had helped you realize there were alternative interpretations. And after that conversation you concluded, the praise made me feel good enough and important, but it didn't really make me good enough or important. So here's what I'd like you to do now. Really imagine that this happened when you were a child. Now imagine that after our conversation, you felt good after getting a positive response from your parents, teachers, or coaches. Notice how it feels to be a child who's thinking, the praise made me feel as if I was good enough or important, but it never really made me good enough or important. You can use the pause button below to pause the video while you make these childhood scenarios more real for yourself. When you're done imagining, press the play button. As you imagine this scene, does it still feel like your parents' words and actions are making you feel what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? Probably not. And if you didn't feel what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly then, would you feel it now? Again, the answer is no. So Mom and Dad's comments never caused you to feel what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly. That feeling came from your interpretation of their behavior. And since your feelings were not caused by events in reality, they were only the result of a meaning you made up to explain the events, is it real that the good feeling you had about yourself when your parents praised you for doing things perfectly didn't tell you anything at all about really what makes you good enough or important? They didn't, did they? Okay? Now take a deep breath. Let it out slowly and then say out loud, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly. Is this the truth? Does it still feel like the truth? Your answer is very important here. Don't forget that we form beliefs to give meaning to events that have no real meaning. Having done that, we then think we observe the meaning in the events, out there in the world. It becomes a fact for us. Once we realize that the earlier events never had any real meaning, that the meaning was only in our mind, that it was never a fact, that the feeling we had was caused by the meaning we gave meaningless events, the belief disappears forever. So take another deep breath and say, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly, out loud. I bet it feels very different when you say these words now than when you said them at the beginning of this exercise. Do these words feel true even a little bit? Unless the belief is 100% gone and the words don't feel true at all, you probably still have the belief. Remember, holding a belief is like being pregnant. You either is or you ain't. There's no sort of. If the belief is still there, it probably still seems like you saw it. Once it no longer seems as if you saw what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly in those early events, the belief will be gone. So please click the repeat button to repeat that step of the process. If the belief is gone, please click Continue. Now that you're clear the belief really is gone, let me congratulate you for eliminating your 16th belief. You only have 3 more beliefs and a few conditionings to eliminate, and your lack of self-confidence and your need for others to accept and approve of you will be totally gone for good. But as a result of getting rid of this belief and all the ones that came before, I'll bet you already can see a big change in your feelings and behavior. The little voice that criticizes has become quieter. Your self-doubt has decreased a lot. You've been less concerned with what others think of you. In fact, by now you should have started to notice some real changes in your behavior and feelings. Before you move on to the next belief, you might want to revisit the process, who am I really? It enables you to feel that you're the creator of your life. You experience on a very profound level that anything's possible. You have no limitations. Many clients have told me that this is their favorite part of the entire Lefko method. Now you can either click Who Am I Really? Click Next Belief to get rid of another belief, or close this program. Then make a note to yourself when you plan to return and resume the program.